Soldiers at the Battle of Stalingrad became trapped inside a frozen nightmare. When it began, it was summer of 1942, and the Germans launched a massive offensive to seize the Soviet city of Stalingrad. On paper, it was just another step toward cutting off Soviet oil in the south. In reality, it became one of the deadliest battles in human history. German troops entered the city expecting a quick win. What they got was house-to-house combat, room by room, floor by floor. Soviet soldiers were ordered to hold the city at any cost. And they did, by turning every ruined building into a fortress. The city itself was already reduced to rubble from days of bombing, but that rubble became the battlefield. There were no front lines, so to speak, just snipers hiding in walls, grenades thrown through holes in the floor, and sudden ambushes in dark basements. German commanders called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War, because it felt like hunting through a sewer maze. By winter, things got worse, much worse. Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army. No food, no medicine, no reinforcements. Just snow, frostbite, and starvation. Soldiers froze in their foxholes. They had to eat their own horses. Some men even boiled wallpaper to get to the glue. Inside the pocket, German field hospitals ran out of supplies. Amputations were done without pain relief. Many wounded were simply left behind, lying in barns or basements, too weak to move. Outside, Soviet artillery shelled what was left of the city night and day. When the surrender came in February 1943, the German commander, General Paulus, had been promoted to field marshal because no German field marshal had ever surrendered. He did anyway. Of the 300,000 Axis troops sent into the city, fewer than 100,000 were taken prisoner, and of those, only 5,000 ever returned home. For Soviet soldiers, the cost was even higher. Hundreds of thousands perished, but they did hold the city. For Roman soldiers marching to Cannae in 216 BCE, confidence was high. They outnumbered the enemy. They were well-armed, well-trained, and battle-hardened. What they didn't know was that they were walking into one of the most devastating ambushes in history. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who had already crossed the Alps with elephants and stunned Rome, was outnumbered, maybe 50,000 troops against 80,000 Romans. But he didn't need numbers. He needed a plan. And he had one. Hannibal arranged his troops in a subtle curve, his weakest forces in the center, strongest on the flanks. When the Romans attacked, they went straight into the middle. It worked. The Carthaginian center gave ground slowly, pulling the Romans deeper in. They believed they were winning. That's when the trap closed. Hannibal's cavalry had already defeated the Roman horsemen on the wings. Now the Carthaginian flanks folded inward. Roman troops, packed shoulder to shoulder in tight ranks, suddenly found themselves surrounded on all sides. In minutes, the momentum turned into chaos. There was no room to fight, and as the circle tightened, men couldn't raise their weapons. Many couldn't even fall when struck. They were held upright by the bodies around them. According to ancient sources, over 50,000 Romans were lost in a single day. That number is debated, but even conservative estimates agree. It was a catastrophe. Entire legions were wiped out. It was one of the worst military defeats in Rome's long history. For the soldiers inside that circle, it must have been overwhelming. You couldn't see a way out, just a wall of shields pressing in, with steel flashing in the sun. One historian called it the perfect battle of annihilation, and for centuries generals would study it for Hannibal's brilliant execution. The Battle of Somme started on July 1, 1916, and was the largest artillery bombardment in history at that point. For 7 days, Allied forces shelled the German lines, believing they'd destroyed the barbed wire and wiped out the defenders. But when the bombardment stopped and the whistles blew, the soldiers climbed out of their trenches and found the enemy still waiting. The first day alone was catastrophic. British forces suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the worst day in British military history. And it didn't stop there. The battle dragged on for 141 days, through summer and into the freezing autumn. Soldiers had to live in waterlogged trenches, slept next to fallen comrades, and pushed forward across open fields under relentless machine gun fire. Many never made it more than a few yards before being hit. Medical aid was primitive. If you were injured, you might lie in no man's land, sometimes for days, moaning through the rain, hoping someone could reach you before nightfall. Mud was everywhere. It filled boots and clogged weapons. Meanwhile, shells exploded constantly, tearing up the same ground again and again, turning the battlefield into a landscape of craters and ruin. One soldier described the Somme as a place where bodies covered the ground like snow. By the end of the battle in November, over 1 million men were wounded, captured, or lost, and all for a gain of just a few miles. No decisive breakthrough, no clear victory. Just unimaginable suffering on both ends. If you were a soldier in the Battle of Hue, you weren't in a jungle or open field. You were in a city. And not just any city. Hue was the cultural heart of Vietnam, filled with temples, courtyards, and stone walls centuries old. But in January 1968, it became one of the deadliest battlegrounds of the Vietnam War. The battle began as part of the Tet Offensive, a massive surprise attack launched by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces during what was supposed to be a holiday ceasefire. In Hue, they seized control of most of the city within hours. U.S. Marines, Army units, and South Vietnamese forces were sent in to take it back. What followed was nearly a month of brutal street-to-street combat. This wasn't the kind of war American soldiers had trained for. In the countryside, the enemy often hit and ran. But in Hue, they stayed and fought. Every building, every rooftop, every alley became a potential ambush. U.S. troops had to advance house by house, clearing each structure under fire. Rooms were booby-trapped, doorways were covered by snipers. Basements and attacks often hid fighters waiting for the perfect shot. It was a chaotic battlefield where fighting occurred in fragmented pockets across the city. Even tanks and air support had limited use. Hue was packed with civilians, many of them trapped. So soldiers had to hold fire when they didn't know who was inside. The North Vietnamese fortified key positions using stone walls and prepared defenses, turning Hue into a maze of resistance. The weather didn't help either. Frequent rain turned streets into muck, reduced visibility, and caused weapons and radios to malfunction. Some soldiers fought for days with barely any sleep, food, or supplies. At night, the city was a shadow war. Enemy fighters would sneak through the ruins, plant explosives, or stage counterattacks under the cover of darkness. You could clear a building 1 hour, and by morning it was taken again. The battle lasted 26 days. Longer than D-Day, longer than the Battle of the Bulge. When it ended, approximately 216 American troops, about 384 South Vietnamese soldiers, and an estimated 2,400 to 8,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong lives had been taken, alongside 2,800 to 6,000 civilians. It was one of the fiercest battles U.S. forces had faced since World War II. Roman soldiers marching into Teutoburg Forest in the year 9 CE thought they were in friendly territory. They were told it was just a routine movement, just another show of force in a pacified province. But what they were really walking into was a trap, a 3-day nightmare from which almost no one came back. The Roman commander, Publius Quintilius Varus, led around 20,000 troops deep into the German wilderness. His guide was a local tribal leader named Arminius, who was secretly organizing a rebellion. When the signal came, German warriors rose from the trees and brush, surrounding the Roman columns from all sides. This wasn't a battlefield the Romans were used to. There were no open fields, no clear lines, just thick forest, narrow paths, pouring rain, and deep mud. Roman formations fell apart instantly. Their shields couldn't link. Their cavalry couldn't charge. Germanic fighters struck from the trees with spears, slings, and ambush tactics, and then vanished again. The Romans couldn't see them. They just heard the shouts, the drums, and the whistle of something flying through the branches. It was like they were being hunted. For 3 days, the Romans tried to escape. They built camps at night, only to be surrounded again by morning. Some panicked and fled. Others were bogged down in swampy ground and overrun. Supply wagons were abandoned. Wounded were left behind. By the 3rd day, discipline had collapsed. Varus, realizing this situation was hopeless, reportedly fell on his sword. The rest of his army was slowly and relentlessly picked apart. Of the approximately 15 to 20,000 men who entered the forest, only a few dozen to a few hundred survived. The aftermath was gruesome. Years later, Roman patrols found skulls nailed to trees. Emperor Augustus was said to have wandered his palace shouting, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." This defeat took away Rome's ambition to conquer Germania east of the Rhine. For many American soldiers, the winter of 1944 was supposed to be a break. The front lines in Belgium were quiet. Morale was decent. Supplies were coming in. Some units were resting. But then, on December 16th, before dawn, all of that changed. More than 200,000 German troops launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, breaking through a weak point in the American lines. The assault was fast, violent, and completely unexpected. What followed was 6 weeks of chaos, snow, and unimaginable hardship. They called it the Battle of the Bulge because of the shape the front lines took, and for the soldiers inside, it felt like a trap. The weather turned almost instantly. Freezing temperatures, snowstorms, and fog. Many U.S. troops had been rushed to the line and didn't even have proper winter gear. Their boots weren't insulated. Some had no gloves, and yet they were expected to fight. In towns like Bastogne, American units were surrounded. Supplies ran low. There was no way out and almost no way to get help in. Artillery fire never stopped, and some foxholes filled with snow. In some cases, wounded soldiers had to lie still in freezing cold for hours, even days, waiting for medics, and at the same time hoping not to be found by the enemy. Food was scarce, water froze in canteens, and soldiers were forced to burn anything they could find just to stay alive. Sometimes that meant setting fire to their own equipment. One unit, the 101st Airborne, famously held Bastogne against overwhelming odds. When German commanders demanded they surrender, the American response was a single word: nuts. In total, around 90,000 Americans were wounded, captured, or lost, making it the costliest battle the U.S. fought in World War II. For those who survived, it wasn't just the enemy they remembered. It was the cold, the fear, the isolation, and the constant question, when will help come? If you asked veterans of World War I what the worst place was, many gave the same answer: Passchendaele. The battle began in July 1917 near the Belgian village of Passchendaele. The mission was to break through German lines and reach the coast. But almost immediately, everything went wrong. This was Flanders, a low, flat land area scarred by years of war. When the rain came, and combined with weeks of constant shelling that destroyed the drainage systems, the battlefield was turned into a swamp. Trenches collapsed, craters filled with water, and soldiers sank into it, literally. Men, horses, and even wagons disappeared into the mud. Soldiers described watching comrades slowly slip under the surface, helpless to pull them out. Rifles clogged, stretchers got stuck, and wounds became infected within minutes. The mud wasn't the only threat. German machine guns and artillery rained down as Allied troops advanced, slowly, painfully across the destroyed ground. With every step, boots got heavier. Some soldiers took hours just to crawl a few hundred yards. At night, there was no rest. Waterlogged dugouts collapsed. Rats feasted on the remains of the fallen. Gas attacks drifted through the low ground, clinging to the wet air. The battle lasted nearly 4 months, and when it ended in November 1917, the Allies had captured the ruins of Passchendaele, but at a terrible price. an estimated 500,000 men were wounded, lost, or taken prisoner, all for a gain of just a few miles. In the winter of 1950, thousands of American and United Nations troops found themselves deep in the mountains of North Korea, cut off, surrounded, and facing one of the most grueling ordeals in modern military history. It was called the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, and for the soldiers who fought there, it was a fight not just against a determined enemy, but against the elements, exhaustion, and the limits of human endurance. In late November 1950, U.S. and United Nations forces were pushing deep into North Korea, thinking the war was nearly over. But then, without warning, approximately 120,000 to 150,000 Chinese troops crossed the border and launched a massive surprise attack in the Chosin Reservoir area. What followed was a 2-week ordeal in the mountains of North Korea, in temperatures that dropped as low as -30 degrees Fahrenheit, -34 Celsius. The cold was its own kind of enemy. Weapons jammed, engines wouldn't even start, medicine froze in its syringes, soldiers' hands stuck to their rifles, and frostbite was everywhere. Some men froze to the ground in their sleep. The U.S. Marines and Army troops at Chosin were surrounded, outnumbered more than 4 to 1, and stretched along narrow mountain roads. Supply lines were cut. Every movement came under fire, and if you were wounded, your chances of evacuation were slim, and your chances of freezing before help arrived were high. And meanwhile, the fighting didn't stop. The Chinese attacked in human waves, charging at night through snow and fog. It was relentless. Soldiers fought with frozen fingers and frozen boots, in the dark, on cliffs and hills with names like Fox Hill and Hellfire Valley. Yet somehow, the U.S. forces didn't collapse. They fought their way out, a fighting withdrawal over 78 miles of icy mountain road. In total, approximately 17,000 U.S. Marines and soldiers were lost, wounded, or missing or injured, while an estimated 30,000 to 60,000 troops on the Chinese side met the same fate in the brutal cold and combat. The battle became legend among U.S. forces, and a symbol of discipline under pressure and endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. Verdun was a test of human endurance over the unimaginable. It began in February 1916, when German forces launched a massive assault on the French city of Verdun. Their goal wasn't just to take the city, it was to bleed the French army dry. One German general reportedly said, "We will bleed France white." That was the strategy: attrition. Not victory, just exhaustion. French troops dug in, and what followed was 300 days of non-stop combat, the longest single battle of World War I. The shelling was relentless, with millions of shells fired over the battle, including an estimated 1.5 million in the opening bombardment alone. Trees were obliterated, villages vanished, and the earth itself seemed to grow under the weight of steel and fire. Soldiers on both sides lived and often perished in the mud, trenches flooded with rain and blood. The air was thick with smoke and gas. Men slept next to the fallen because there was nowhere else to go. Even the wounded sometimes couldn't be evacuated for days. Verdun became a unique kind of horror. The front never moved much. Just the same hills, the same forts passed back and forth in a nightmare loop. Places like Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux became legendary because of how many lives were consumed inside their shattered walls. It's said that the French called it the furnace. By the end, in December 1916, nearly 700,000 men had been wounded, lost, or taken prisoner. The French held the line, but the cost was devastating. For the soldiers, Verdun meant endless terror. Imagine knowing every step outside the trench might be your last. Or worse, knowing you'd have to go back again tomorrow, over and over, for months. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific was reaching its final, most brutal phase. The U.S. military set its sights on Okinawa, a Japanese island just 340 miles from the mainland. Taking it would be key for launching a potential invasion of Japan itself, but no one was prepared for what it would cost. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, and it lasted nearly 3 months. It became the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and one of the most traumatic for the soldiers who fought there. At first it seemed like the landings would be easy. U.S. forces came ashore with minimal resistance, but that was by design. The Japanese had pulled back into fortified ridges, caves, and tunnels in the southern half of the island, setting a trap. What followed was a slow, grinding nightmare. The terrain was treacherous, and every advance meant inching uphill against hidden guns, machine fire, and coordinated ambushes. And Japanese defenders didn't surrender. They fought until the very end, sometimes emerging from tunnels after dark to attack by hand. U.S. troops often couldn't tell if a cave held a dozen men or just one waiting with a surprise. Above them, the skies were no safer. Waves of kamikaze pilots, Japanese aviators on one-way missions, struck U.S. ships offshore. Dozens of vessels were sunk or badly damaged. Even hospital ships weren't spared. And then there were the civilians. Okinawa was home to hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, many of whom were caught in the crossfire or forced into mass self-harm by propaganda, warning of what would happen if they surrendered. It was heartbreaking and horrifying, and for the soldiers witnessing it, deeply scarring. By the time the battle ended in late June, the U.S. had suffered over 49,000 casualties, including more than 12,000 lives lost. Japanese military losses were even higher, and tens of thousands of civilians were gone. The difficulty at the Battle of Okinawa and the desire to avoid such losses again significantly influenced the U.S.'s decision to use atomic bombs against Japan just weeks later. Thank you for watching and making it to the end of the video. It's so hard to imagine the situation these soldiers faced in these terrible battles. Which do you think was the most brutal? And of course, there are other brutal battles that didn't make the list. Which do you think we should have mentioned? I'd love to hear your take. Please leave a comment down below. And if you liked the video or learned something, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. And subscribe for more videos like this in the future. In fact, there should be another video on your screen right now about the worst wars in history. So check it out. Thanks again. See you next time.